Hi, good evening, everybody. Um, Welcome to this evening's session. As you know, this is being hosted by the National HRD Network, and today's session is on loss and grief. Just to brief background to those who have not been attending the previous sessions, NHRD in October last year started a campaign called Mind Matters. It's a mental health campaign, and the intent behind it was to get people talking about mental health, provide a little more information around mental health, and try and destigmatize it and normalize conversations around mental health. So given the times we're going through and the crisis of this pandemic and the extreme stress that it has put upon all of us, we at the NHRD decided to extend the part of the campaign during this time to try and support people who are in distress and might need a little bit of inputs on what's going on around us and how possibly we could manage a little better or cope a little better with what's happening. What we've been doing is every Friday for an hour from 6 to 7, we've been having a session on various topics. We've also put out a toolkit, and I will show you that in a minute. Just there you go. So every Friday, these are the sessions we've been having. The first one was on coping with anxiety and depression. We talked about challenges that HR professionals in particular, being an HR fraternity, we said the particular challenges that HR professionals possibly would be going through. We talked about caregiving and mental health challenges that caregivers experience. We had a session on parenting, and this session is on loss and grief. The previous sessions are up on our YouTube channel, on NHRD's YouTube channel, and we'll put up the link to that in a bit in the chat window. Yeah. The toolkit that we have put together, we are hoping it will help people to just make sense of a little bit of sense of what we're going through and the emotions that are sort of rampaging for all of us. So a little bit of insight into what could be the signs and symptoms of anxiety related to this time that we're going through, the turbulence of COVID, really. Yeah. Some tips to deal with what's going on right now as an individual, as a parent, as a caregiver. These are sort of categories that we've tried to cover in the toolkit. Yeah. Some tips on how to have conversations with people who are undergoing anxiety. We've tried and put some well-known EAP numbers and helpline numbers, support numbers. There are a whole lot more have come up in the last few months, which we've not been able to put in the toolkit. But the idea is be aware of and make use of these support numbers. These seats, could we ask for the audience to be on mute, please? Thank you. We've also tried to put together some best practices from some companies who have been kind enough to share it with us. So all that is there in the toolkit. Yeah. Right. Today's session is on loss and grief, coping with loss and grief. And I'm really pleased to have with us two people who have experience working with this subject and have developed an expertise around it, if you will, on the impact it's had and it has on us and how debilitating it can be and what can we do in the face of this sometimes crippling emotion. Yeah. And I look to them today really to help us understand it a little better and to guide us to be able to manage it in a way that doesn't derail us. Yeah. So really happy today to introduce Bhavana and Suzy. Bhavana Issar we've met before in our caregiving session. She's founder and CEO of Caregiver Saathi. It's a social venture which supports family caregivers as companions for their well-being across a variety of psychosocial needs, coaching, counseling, support groups, training. They do a range of things. Um, Bhavna's a passionate person, diverse interests. She, she's an organization consultant in the area of change and leadership management. She's also a fellow and facilitator in process work with Sumedha's Academy in Gestalt. She's a Gestalt OD practitioner as well. She doesn't to look it, but she's also a motorcyclist and believes that biking has helped her to push the boundaries of both body and mind. Yeah, so there's a side to Bhavna which is not immediately apparent on your screen, right? Very, very pleased to have today with us Suzy Singh, who's the author of the international best-selling book, 7 Karma Codes. It's available in 3 languages. Suzy is a mental health coach. She's an international speaker. She's a certified clinical hypnotherapist, a karma coach, and a YouTube educator. This is in her past avatar. She was in advertising. She was former GM of Lintas, which is a familiar name to all of us. Currently advisor to the board at the mental health NGO We Listen, through which she also coaches and inspires young people. Suzy does personal therapy sessions. She's helped thousands of people across the world with that. She's authored articles in leading publications for over 25 years. She teaches at business schools as guest faculty and speaks on both national and international platforms on karma or consciousness, wellness. So I'm very pleased to have you here with us today, Suzy. Welcome to both of you. Just to set the context a little bit, okay, one couple more housekeeping announcements before we jump into it. If we could have the audience on mute, please, and anything you'd like to discuss or say, please put it into the chat box. We are encouraging people to put questions on Slido, and that's there in your chat as well. This is only so that we get to see the questions and don't miss it in the chatter on the chat box. Yeah. The second thing is, please put your view on the Zoom on speaker view so that you see the speakers and not everybody. Right? Thank you. Okay, coming back to the subject of today's session. This is something that we have been discussing for a long time as to whether we should do it, how should we do it, because this is such a personal and traumatic subject, isn't it? I mean, losing a loved one during the pandemic is it's really rough. It's a rough journey, and it's a very personal journey. There's no right way to grieve. It hurts. It's very isolating, especially now when you're not able to have the comfort of family and friends with you. See, at the best of times, facing the death of someone you love is really, really hard, and this pandemic has made this even more difficult and traumatic. And the nature of COVID is such that that our loss is really sudden and unexpected. We know that people are struggling to find medical help, oxygen, beds, all of that. And family members, it's been so hard to leave someone you love alone in hospital. And you can't, because of the hospital protocols, you can't be with them at the time that possibly you need most to be with them for your own closure, for comfort for them, for you, all of that. Typically, when this sort of thing happens, family members themselves are in quarantine and isolation, right? And some people are facing more than one loss. So these multiple layers of losing dear ones. that some people are facing now. Okay. So, Suzy, let me start with you. Can you help us to understand, is there a universality to how people experience grief? You know, or is it like completely different for each person? What does it look like and feel like?
So, Devika, just like a snowflake, grief is a very individual experience, and everyone experiences grief differently depending on 4 key aspects. The first aspect is, what stage of grieving are they at when we encounter them? Because each stage looks very different. The second could be, what is the relational and psychological factors that are affecting them? And I'll come to each one of these in a little more detail. The third is, what is their EQ and emotional resilience? And the fourth aspect is, what is their spiritual orientation or anchoring? So when we talk about the stages of grief, there are primarily 3 broad stages of grief. The first stage is when the death news arrives, and that is the moment of separation. There is a second stage when you've gone through the death rituals, you've had the chotha, you've had the termi. So the 13 days of the traditional mourning periods, the prayer ceremonies are over. This is a period when people may be actively calling you. Normally it used to be people would come to give you condolences, and that's completely been lost during the COVID. So we find that that community grieving process as a huge missing factor during this period. But that was the period of mourning, the traditional 13-day period, which actually gave individuals the soft landing into this very difficult experience. Second comes the period of integration post that, when grief becomes a very internal and a very personal process. This is the hardest and the longest period. And this period of time is very different for everyone. Some people could recover from that in a month. Some people may take up to a year. But the reintegration happens when you are ready to reconnect with life in your new reality. So depending on which stage you are at, grief will look very different. Let's say you're in the first stage, which I call separation, and this is really the dance of destruction stage, as I like to call it. It's characterized by complete shock, disbelief, what ifs, leave me alone, wanting to go into your own cocoon. I can't go on with this. And the pain seems to just be 24/7. It can be excruciatingly painful for the most people. There may be intense sadness and sorrow. It may become very difficult to focus on anything you don't care about. Your normal routines, they just come to a crashing halt. You have problem accepting the death. There may be denial. There may be complete numbness and shock and just wanting to either not say a word, or may just be staring into space. There may be bitterness over the loss, feelings of hopelessness, inability to get on with life, not wanting to eat and drink. And you may just want to isolate yourself. This is also a period where, if there's not understanding in your environment, you could run into some relational difficulties. You could have some belief that you did something wrong, that you were not able to avert the death, that you are at fault. So there may be some intense blaming happening at this point, either blaming the doctors or blaming the government or blaming yourself for not being able to save your loved one, and wishing that you had died too. So as you can see, that this is an experience very close to, it's like a part of you has died. It's very intense and it's continuous. There is no relief here. And some of the behavioral issues you might have is sleep disturbances, appetite disturbances, absent-mindedness, withdrawing socially, having dreams about the deceased, getting this feeling like they're still around, and you expect them to walk into the room, or you'll walk into a room and you expect them to be sitting there. You want to talk to them. You want to lay an extra plate for their meal. You want to wake up in the morning and say hello to them and expect them to be lying in the bed next to you. You may just cry continuously for days. and break down at the smallest trigger. So we can see this is very, very difficult and very hard. Then comes the integration phase, the second phase, when you're entirely alone, when you're moving inwards, and I call this gathering the ashes phase. The predominant feelings here are, how do I even go on with life? And you start questioning the meaning of your life, the meaning of your existence, and who you are, because, particularly when it's a first degree of separation loss, which is like a parent, a spouse, a child. In those cases, your sense of identity is so closely associated with that person, and that person is gone. So it's like your whole life has been uprooted. You start wondering, who are you without them? And it's literally like you have to rebirth yourself. You have to start from the very scratch again. And here there may be predominant feelings of guilt and regrets that you have to address. Why didn't I spend more time with my beloved people? Why didn't I say the things that I wanted to say to them? Why didn't I tell them I loved them? There may be some anxiety also about survival and daily work because, you don't know how to get on with life. There have been people who've been saying, I never handled any of the financial affairs, and my husband is gone, and I'm clueless about what happened. It was so sudden. I don't even know how much money there is in the bank. So there are questions about daily routine issues and feeling completely helpless about those things.
Yeah.
Then there could be grief waves that come on to you suddenly. So some days may seem like, okay, I've dealt with this. And you're feeling so much better because you feel like you can cope better. And then that very afternoon, there may be a small trigger and you are a complete mess all over again. And this is what a grief wave looks like. There could also be a grief attack where you are not even able to breathe and you may feel this tightness in the chest in the sense that you're about to die yourself. This is also a period when you're learning to reestablish routines, you're struggling, how do I get back to work? There is this whole idea of, should I ask for support? Should I not ask for support? I find a lot of people saying that they're being pressured by the family, their own children, their parents to say, get on with life. What
Move
about your
on with
children?
life,
If you're going to break down, what's going to happen to them? And this is what I call hurrying grief, and it is very detrimental. I got a call this morning from someone who'd just been in this situation, and she was a complete mess. And it was just fortunate that she found the courage to reach out. And I was not in the middle of a clinical session, so I could, connect back with her and support her during that phase. And her question was, I have to get on to whatever work she does. And she had a scheduled session in 20 minutes and she says, I'm a mess, I can't do this. So those kind of situations where you think you're okay enough to get back to life, and then suddenly you encounter these experiences of, no, I can't. So that is very difficult. It's a way of learning to integrate this change. And the reintegration stage, of course, is when you start rebuilding a new life without the person that you lost. You've accepted the changed reality, and now you want to focus once again on living and loving. So you reconnect with your family and friends and loved ones. You're willing to take their calls. You are willing to live with the loss. And you want to find a way of how to remember the person who's no longer in the physical form, and you learn to love them in a new way in their formless state. This is usually accompanied by sporadic grief, usually triggered at events, large gatherings, celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries, when it really comes over you. So as you can see, the 3 stages of grief look very different.
Yes, and thank you for taking us through them, Suzy. I particularly found beautiful the part where you said we learn to love them in a new way. That for me there's some hope there. I don't think there's any of us here today in this session who has not been touched by by personal loss, at least one degree removed at least. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here in this session, right? And I think this COVID has been completely unforgiving and not discriminatory at all. in it, in who it has touched. So thanks. That was like you took us through the whole the whole life cycle, as it were, of grief. But I would like to ask Bhavana, from your experiences, Bhavana, does it happen in in a clear-cut way? Does one go through those three stages? What do you, I mean, those three stages are there, no doubt, but what, for when your experiences, what does it look like for you? What have you experienced, and what have people you've worked with in your caregiving journey experienced?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Suzy, that, that just had so much of my attention. Thank you for framing it that way. As I was listening to you, I was taken back many years to my first real experience of loss, and I think a little dance with grief. So my dad had terminal illness when I was in my teens, and it was a very rare condition. And it is called multiple system atrophy. At that time, it was referred to as shy-dragger syndrome. People had, including doctors, had not even heard the name. And it took a very long time to diagnose the illness. We went through a very painful process of diagnosing, figuring out what it is and what it might mean. And just like you spoke about the psychological state of the person, for us, my father was the epitome of the ideal son and the, you know, the good man who did all the right things. He was definitely the Shravan Kumar to my grandparents. He was the only son. And he was this tall, strapping Air Force officer, a pilot, who suddenly was losing control of his voluntary facilities. So MSA is very debilitating and unforgiving. There is a rapid decline in the person with a very active mind and just no activity of the body. So the body is aging much faster. So it was a 90-year-old man's body with a 50-year-old's brain, and a very active brain. And as a family, we saw that. I think it was just so traumatic to see that happen. I have no recollection of an idea of what all I was losing and what my sense of grief was. I have a very sharp memory of the night that he passed, and a conversation that I had just before with him. And he said, "I don't feel like living anymore. I don't think I have it in me." And this was one man who had spent many years following a discipline, even during his illness, but he just got tired of it and just said, "This is the best that I can do." And it's a painful memory even today. It is 21 years since he passed. I have gone through multiple cycles of working with that memory, memories of him, honoring him. What could my grief and loss be? But I find that for the 25-year-old who had that experience, I had no connection with the sense of loss or grief that I was experiencing. I just had to be the responsible person in the home who had to take charge and who had to be there for the rest of my family. So what I was experiencing was just inconsequential. And I had to put that away in a box and be there in a very functional way for everyone else. And that changed me, that defined me, and that is something that I then lived with for many, many years. It was only, I remember, 14 years later, through a lot of work, that in one setting, I first encountered the pain of the loss that I may have felt. And it is, even as I remember it today, having worked so much on it, it is very painful even today. So in my case, for sure, I didn't follow any steps. And I know for sure that there are many others that I know who may not have gone through the phases or stages. And it may have been an absolute unique path. And I think the biggest pain for me was the realization that I had a lot of love for my father, and I didn't know how to express it. There wasn't any place for that love to go. And for me, that is my grief. In addition to that, I think my grief is also the loss of a young, vibrant girl who could no longer be a young, vibrant girl. And I don't think I knew that. Or, I mean, I still feel that loss today, right? A lot of my friends told me, you don't sound like the person we have known. But even I didn't have anything to be in touch with, to be able to offer it. I'm going to turn off my video because I think there is a lag.
Yeah, there is a lag, Bhavana.
Yeah, but I think what the point that I want to make is that from my personal experience, I revisited the sense of loss and grief after many, many years because I had made a certain frame and a certain response to the grief and loss that I was experiencing. And for a 21, 22, 23-year-old, whatever meaning I made of the circumstance, I dealt with it in that way. There was a lot of advice. So many people would come and say, ask me to talk or ask me to express, whether it was friends or family. But I just didn't have access to my pain to be able to even express myself. So that's the point that I would like to make.
Yeah.
I think.
Thank you, Bhavana. And I think that's resonating with people in the audience as well. You know, the people saying that when they lost their parent, totally confused, didn't know how to process it. So this whole thing of processing, right? What we talk about, processing a feeling, and in this case of grief or of the sense of loss that we have, right? So what happens when if you just close it away and don't process it? What is it that happens? So, you know, what happened to you? And perhaps Suzy can help us with after that to tell us what happens with other people that she's been working with as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear what Suzy's perspective is. What happened for me was that I just didn't have access to what I was really feeling. I think I lost, you know, a sense of self, and I also had lots of guards. I think one becomes. I was definitely numb, and I was definitely distant from myself, and therefore my ability to make connections with other people was also severely impacted. I was definitely functional, but I was not necessarily intimate or connected with many people. And it took many years of chipping away to regain that ability to make a connection and to establish, a connection with myself first before anybody else. So that's what I would say that definitely happened for me. And I also think that when there is disenfranchised grief or complicated grief, I think, which is also true in the current COVID times, because it is mixed, right? In my case, I also had a sense of relief for my dad because he was unwell and he was in so much pain. I didn't want him to have that pain, but it was a huge loss for me and my family. So to co-hold these two things was, another level of loss. And I think that might be true today. When people are really suffering, at some point we want their suffering to end. But it is a loss to us.
Yeah. Yes, thanks, Bhavana, for sharing that. Suzy, some thoughts on what you've seen people experience what happens when if I don't acknowledge my grief and I just get on with the rest of my life and lock it up.
So many things have been observed. One is that the first thing is, like Bhavana mentioned, that there is a sense of isolation. You tend to withdraw and isolate socially. And that can lead to a lot of dysfunctional relationships with people in the family to begin with, and maybe complete disconnection from your friend circle. It can also lead to a lot of conflict with siblings. And I have found that it can bring up ugly, suppressed complexities among the siblings in the family during the period, because the grief is not finding a way to express itself. So it becomes distorted grief with anger and guilt issues, blame games, who did what, who didn't take the responsibility, and you can have ugliness emerging between the siblings itself. We also find that people resort to addictions of all kinds: food, drink, alcohol, substance abuse, to be able to cope and numb themselves from feeling the terror of their own grief or that sense of separation, which they are not able to come to terms with. In other people, it presents itself as when it gets distorted into violent anger, there may be violence against the vulnerable. So you might find them getting verbal violence or even physical violence with children, with elderly people, with women, and with animals, because the grief is finding its outlet in very bizarre and destructive ways. Inhibited grief can also show up as aches and pains in your body. So people who have, they start suffering from all kinds of myalgias, like the fibromyalgias, or you may have chronic headaches that developed around the time when you lose a parent, or undiagnosed pains in the body, which are actually your crystallized grief. I also encountered two personal experiences where grief can actually literally break your heart. And in the first case, the experience was with my own dad. When he was in his early 30s, he lost his father, who he was extremely attached to. And he was not able to process his grief, even though for a year, our house looked like there was no sign of celebration. We were not going to eat food that was interesting. And you could see the grief present in the way we lived, but he wasn't able to express it. And he had his first attack in his early 30s. So, myocardial infarction leading to heart trouble, beginning so early in life and shortly after he lost his father. And very recently, just a couple of months ago, during the pandemic, a very, very dear mentee of mine who was training with me for several years, she was a school teacher in Gujarat, and she lost her father exactly a year ago in the pandemic. And she was never able to get over him. We had a conversation just a week earlier, And she was, I am working on my second book, which is about grief and loss. And so I was interviewing her in that conversation where she actually spoke to me and said she'd been struggling with it and she tried so much. And that was the first time that she felt she'd been given the space to express her grief. While it was a very beautiful experience, I also realized that she was in chronic grief and she was struggling because it had been a year. And 1 week later, I got news that she went to school in the morning and she just dropped dead with a heart attack. It's literally like her heart could not live without him.
Oh my
So, yes, it was shocking for me. She was all of 36 and she had no other ailments. So we can see that grief has many, it can impact us in many destructive ways if we don't process it. And I'd also like to add at this point in time, there is this whole idea of transgenerational grief. Things that we don't deal with, we pass on to our progeny as unresolved issues. And they come into a new life, not tabula rasa, not an empty slate, but with the sins of the fathers that have not been dealt with. So I actually am doing this work very intensely because I feel that we owe it to our children, our grandchildren, and our progeny that will arrive to arrive clean slate. We can't burden them with our unprocessed grief. So a lot of my work is around processing emotions that are lying deeply hidden, layered, nested within us, because it can have detrimental effects. And we find today the incidence of young children with mental health issues is so much higher. I believe one of the causes is the unresolved trauma of their ancestors.
So Suzy, I hear you. My big takeaways are for here and now, and for people who are heavy-hearted and still sort of struggling through the that fog of loss and grief that many of us are experiencing at the moment. What I'm hearing from you is that if we don't stop and acknowledge it or process it in an adequate manner, it will result in further impacting us in terms of our own physical health, mental health, our own well-being, really going forward, right? And it is in the interest of keeping ourselves well, and certainly in the interest of future generations and our families and friends, we do have that responsibility to keep ourselves well. And that's
absolutely
what I'm hearing, that we should put in that work to be well, right?
And Devika, I'd like to make the point that I lost my father last year just at the onset of the lockdown, at the pandemic. For me, it was a brutal experience because having done so much work with death and dying and grief, I'd had these conversations with my parents about the time when this eventuality would strike us. We talked about what role I would play when that would happen and how I would support them through this period to move into or to affix their attention on the divine in the moments when they were taking their last breaths. And for me to cremate my father over a Zoom call broke me completely.
So this is the tragic part, isn't it, of what people are experiencing, that you can't be with your loved ones, you can't do the small things that give them and you comfort.
Yeah, the fact that I could not touch my father's feet and bid him farewell and kiss his forehead, the fact that I could not be there to support my younger brother, my mother. I met them a year after the pandemic when it was safe enough for them to come to Delhi from Mumbai. And I had to, that is what made me actually start working on the second book about what I call active grieving, because I had to work very intensely and very actively. I had a history. I know that my father had suffered a heart attack because of his unprocessed grief, and I could not repeat that family pattern. I owed it to my future generations to be able to resolve this.
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter if you're in today's, where we are now in this pandemic. It really doesn't matter if you're in the next street or thousands of miles away.
Yes.
That distance still is not permitting you, isn't it? Yes, I think every one of us has either gone through or knows somebody very close to us who's going through it right now. And this is one of the reasons we're having this session, really, because just to help us make sense of this. How do we make sense of this? Yeah.
And the other thing, Devika, that I find a lot of people very anguished about is when the loved one has been COVID positive and has passed on because of that, and they have not been given permission to even attend the cremations, because some of the countries and in India also, they have to be cremated by the authorities. And the fact that they are not able to do the death rituals, which are a rite of passage for them, makes them feel guilty at many levels, makes them feel that they were not able to give their loved ones the kind of farewell that they deserved. Yes. And that is terrible too.
Yeah. And there's one of the things that we've got, questions that we've got on the Slido is from a person who lost their father very recently, 18 days ago. And his question is really that he's developed a shivering in his hands, and he's become overly sensitive about the safety of the rest of his family. How do I deal with this is his question. So would you, Bhavana, could I ask you to address that?
Wow, that's going to be a tough question. You always ask me the tough questions, Devika, but I love you for that. I wish there was a prescription, and I wish there was a set of things that one could say that you could process it one way or the other. I do think that it requires a longer conversation, and it requires an understanding of your unique circumstances for anybody to be able to recommend what is it that you could do, or how is it that you could work with your sense of loss or the grief. So I would be a little mindful of, responding to that question here specifically, but I would certainly suggest that I think that a conversation with the rest of the family is worth having in terms of saying, how am I being impacted, or what is it that I am remembering, or what are the memories that I am holding? So I think many times, out of our desire to protect the others in the family, lest they be shattered, lest they be affected, we do not share our sense of sorrow. We keep ourselves, at least I did. I kept myself collected so that, lest my mother or my grandmother or my younger brother would be impacted by my sense of loss. But sharing our loss is a way of establishing connection. So I do think that talking about your loss is important. The next is that I do think that our body has a response. So each body has a different response. So if you are able to notice that, that is very nice. Maybe intuitively listening to your body and being kind to your body for whatever it is responding to might be a way for you to just allow for it to heal. Our bodies also know how to heal. Our bodies also know how to respond to other people. So allowing for whatever time it takes and whatever form it takes to be guided by what your body is telling you is the second thing that I would say would be very important. I do think that as far as, Suzy beautifully pointed out the impact of not following rituals, we have a socialization process, right? I'm reminded of a tribal community, and, one of their rituals when somebody dies is to have a huge celebration. So they have a huge party, they have a lot of dancing, and there is the belief that when someone has transitioned, that is the way that they will, they need to be bid farewell. But we are socially conditioned to follow a set of rituals, to do a set of things. And that is the right thing, because that will tell us that we have done our sense of duty and our responsibility. I do think there is a play of us to accept what circumstances have been thrown at us. So yes, it is painful that the expectations that we had set up, the belief that we had of what our responsibility and our love and our expression of love for the lost person is, will not be in the frame of how we have known it to be, but it can be in a different way. That is the pain, right? I have always known that here is a set of things I will do, but I'm not going to be able to do them. And there needs to be this acceptance of this new reality. And that's the pain.
So this is a pain that, not only the person who has suffered the bereavement has, Bhavna and Suzy, it's also the others who are around in this time, because we're not physically able to be with people, right? So how do we offer our support? How do we condole with them? How do we mourn with them, right? What do we do with this? How do I address it?
So, sorry, go ahead.
I'd love to hear what Suzy has to say. And I'll just say that I find that what works for me is that I get in touch with what's at the bottom of my stomach or in my heart, and I share where I am. There are times when I feel absolutely hollow and I'm at a loss of words. But if I can have a shared silence and a presence, and I can do it in the most authentic way for me, which could be a voice note, which could be a call, which could be a picture, which could be something that I convey to the other person that I'm with you, I'm holding your hand, works for me. If someone were to say that I were to have a conversation that would have these right words, it wouldn't work for me.
Right.
So I have to establish an authentic connection.
Yeah. So you're saying don't say nothing. Don't ignore it. Don't say nothing. Do reach out and say something that is meaningful to you, is what I'm hearing you say, Bhavana. Right?
I'm also saying, well, not necessarily. I'm also saying that if it means pick up the phone and say, I have no words, but I just want to connect with you. And I want to share a minute of silence with you, because I know words have no meaning, have been very, very powerful in some cases.
Thank you. Yeah. Suzy, love to hear what you have to say on this.
So Devika, I'd actually like to go back to the last question first, which was what this gentleman had asked about him shivering and his hands shaking. I just wanted to add another point to that because I think it may be useful for him.
Yeah.
Mostly these are symptoms of hidden fear. The shaking of the hands, because when we are very scared, then there is trembling. And there is a active concern with about the family and the family's welfare. And if I were to draw from what I'm experiencing in my grief work presently, what I find is that there is a lot of anticipatory grief with people. Now, that word has assumed a whole new meaning today. Traditionally, the word anticipatory grief meant when you're waiting for someone to die, who you can see the symptoms, and you can see the symptoms of death approaching. But today we are finding with this second wave, where it has affected people who are much younger, 25 to 60, when we find that the children have developed severe afflictions, what I'm finding is that a lot of people are terrified that their loved ones will also die. They've already suffered one loss, and there is this unsaid fear that will happen, or that they will also die.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, then there is this fear of, if I die, how will they manage without me? If they die, how will I bear that suffering? So a lot of this is something you don't want to acknowledge even to your own self, because there is another belief associated with it. If I think about it, I will manifest it. If I state it or discuss it with someone, it will come true. So it just festers and rots inside, and then it becomes like phobic, and there is terror inside, and it is continuous, and it's always there. So I would urge this gentleman to just, if need be, write it on a sheet of paper, all his fears, and then he can just burn that sheet of paper and put the ashes into a pot, so that at least he can get it out of his system. Keeping it inside, keeping it trapped inside is what is really seemed to be troubling him, because I've seen many such cases presently. So I just thought I'd add this little bit for his benefit, if he would like to work with this approach. Now, coming back to how should we address people who are grieving? I personally feel that at a time when people are very isolated, when people struggle with what to say and we are very awkward in the face of grief, it's very important to communicate. Whether it's over a WhatsApp, if people are willing to have a voice call or a video call, depending on your proximity of relationship and comfort with the bereaved. I think it's very important to say, express that you're so terribly sorry for their loss, that you want to be there for them, that you're there any time of day or night if they are feeling low and they feel like talking, if they just want you to be there on the other side of the phone to share silence where no words are expressed, but the sense of knowing that I'm there. One thing that I find extremely powerful is, I've had a lot of people calling me up and saying, can you connect with my father's spirit, or my whoever the beloved deceased is, and can you find out from them whether they are healthy now, because they died of COVID and they were in terrible distress. Are they comfortable? Have they been able to let go of the entanglements? Did they have any last words to say? So knowing that these are common incompletions, I like to invite the person that I call and say, would you allow me to pray for your dear departed along with you? And then I address each one of these concerns and pray for that, I pray that your father is healthy. I pray that your father has merged with the light. I pray that your father has met with the ancestors. I pray that your father is blessing you from the other side. I pray that your love may continue through eons, and that you may have the strength to learn to love them in this new formless way, because love never dies. I find that brings great comfort to the other person.
Thank you, Suzy. There's another aspect to this, right? When we're saying these things, it's we're probably more comfortable saying these to people who we are close to, or who we are. But there are questions around in organizations. My colleagues, someone close to my colleague, or a loved one for my colleague has died, and how do I address that? How do I speak with that person? Should I bring it up at all, or is it just business as usual?
So Devika, yesterday I was leading a grief circle in an organization, a large tech organization. And I was connecting with a group of people who'd lost their parents, some of them both their parents. So we can imagine the degree of loss there. I have never known these individuals. They were on mute and no video, so I couldn't even see who I was connecting with. But at a soul level, the connection was so intense that I prayed for each one of them, and it was a most beautiful experience. So I feel that the kind of situation that we are in today, where the collective has become so strong, we should not be limited by the barriers of organization, family, distant friend, close friend. The degrees of separation have dissolved, I think, in a very large way, because, you know, we have this in our heads that this is work and this is home. But the person grieving is one person.
Yeah, it's time to just see human beings. We're all in this together.
Yeah, it's time for us to come down to our most basic essence. And I think that's what COVID is teaching us.
Yeah.
We've had far too many degrees of separation. At the end of it all, we are human. Can we please connect with each other from a human essence, one to one, loving, caring, expressing compassion, and that word compassion, because it's bandied around at this time a lot. And I just want to define that word. Compassion is all about being able to suffer along with others. And I don't need to know anyone intimately. I don't even need to be acquainted with them to be able to suffer with them. I can look into their eyes, or I can connect with them from my soul. I can hear the quiver in their voice.
Yes.
And automatically the tears flow.
Of not being able to put an arm around somebody. This is the challenge now today.
Yes.
But
the fact is, it depends on how attuned I am to my own emotions. If I'm deeply attuned to my own emotions, only then can I lend the empathy and the compassion to others. If I am struggling with connecting with myself emotionally, I will not be able to offer that now.
So Suzy and Bhavana, we are, we are close to the end of our session, unfortunately, and I don't know where the hour has gone, frankly. But I think we can discuss this for like hours, really, without touching the core of it. Really, thank you, Bhavana. What I would like before we close up is to get an idea, for our audience to get an idea of maybe a few things that those of us who are hurting. I've lost somebody in the last 3 days. Each day I've got a message for somebody that I know well who has passed on. And frankly, there's brain fog right now. And if you could give us just a few things that we can take away in terms of how do we go on? What do we do?
So I'll take this, Devika. What I would like to say is, I was having a conversation about, the things that we are setting up in our organization at Caregiver Saathi. And this lovely woman pointed out to me, saying that, there's only one thing that we all have to do, and that is die. I think it's a shocking statement, but it says that it is the final truth, right? That we all have to die. But there is that whole journey to acceptance of this reality, which is the spiritual anchorage that Suzy spoke about earlier. I think accepting this reality is the first important thing. And I would like to bring in a concept from Gestalt, which is that, there is a cycle of experience, and our life is a cycle of experience. And in that, I think we are unable to move from one cycle to another cycle if there is pending unfinished business. And that is also, that this concept also ties in with transgenerational grief that Suzy spoke about, that our energies can be trapped in unfinished business. And when we are grieving and we have love that has no place to go, then our energies are trapped in that unfinished business. So I'm a big believer of each one of us figuring out what might be my way of dealing with my unfinished business with that person and that relationship. It could be very different for
So you're
two or
going
three
back to
different people.
self-awareness, really, that Suzy talked about, that you need to be aware of your own feelings and your own, the thoughts and feelings that are going on inside of you, and not just lock them up, right? And that is the
And
process.
find a way of honoring it. Yes. And find a way of honoring it, because
Alright.
only then can you move to the next.
Okay. I'm afraid we are at 7 o'clock. So while I would love to stay and, learn more from the two of you in this, on this journey, really, we need to close. And I think
Devika,
there's
can I
a
request
message.
for just half a minute
Yes.
to just say something, because I think, again, for our audience,
Mm.
death rituals and grief rituals are very important. The death rituals happen because that is mandatory. That's how we depart, let them depart. But grief rituals are something that I would suggest people work with. It helps them with completions. One way of doing them is writing letters to the deceased. Any regrets that you have, any things you wanted to say to them but didn't have the opportunity to say to them. Some people say, I have had a lot of men telling me, I wanted to just tell my father I loved him. A lot of men. So I tell them, write letters to the deceased. Have soul connection with them, where you imagine their soul standing in front of you and say whatever you want to them that you couldn't say to them while they were embodied. Invite them into your dreams to come and leave messages for them so that you can continue to feel connected. Some of these things are very, very important for them to practice. It will bring them great relief. And how would you like to remember your loved ones? Whether you want to make video memories of them, whether you want to write books like I'm doing, whether you want to write grief poetry, please work with that. It will bring you tremendous peace.
That's
Thank you
wonderful.
for those additional moments.
No, thank you. That was invaluable for us as well. Thank you both so much for being with us today. I would request people, if we could, one of the rituals that we might honor our loved ones with, who we have lost, and is to have a minute's silence. So may we have a minute's silence now before we end the session, please? Just if we can just sit in silence, think of the people that we have lost, think of the ones who are grieving, and send them our love and our support through this difficult time. We can just sit quietly for a minute, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Devika.
Thank you both for your
Thank
time.
you, Devika, and
Thank
thank you
everybody
all
for
for being
us
here.
this evening. I should close the session with that. Thank you.